Hello, and welcome to Your Estate Matters with your hosts, my colleague Greg Bernand and myself, Nicole Garten of Heritage Trust.
Your Estate Matters is a podcast dedicated to everything estates, including building and preserving your legacy.
If it's estate related, we'll be talking about it. We're having the conversations today that will help Canadians protect their families, their assets, and their legacies tomorrow.
Cindy, thanks for being with us here today to discuss all things wealth and wealth transition. Tell us about yourself and your career journey navigating family wealth transitions.
Well, thanks. I have a bit of an unusual career path. It's taken me about probably 35 years to figure out what I wanted to do and when I grew up. So I'm finally, I think, here. I've had my own business for 4 years now and really work with families and collaborate with their other advisors to help families get very clear on their goals, understand how their structures work and their legal documents work together to find really solid recommendations for each family's unique circumstances. But what's led me here is this very unusual background of education and practical work. I started out, did my Bachelor of Commerce degree and ended up going into accounting, worked as the controller at a major Calgary, national law firm as soon as I got my CA, but found and fell in love with law and ended up going back to law school here in Calgary, did my LLB here and ended up loving law so much I wanted to do an LLM. And on my way to getting my LLM, I had a clerkship at the BC Court of Appeal and was called to the bar in British Columbia. So I practiced for many years as a tax and trust lawyer in Canada, primarily in Vancouver and Calgary. Also co-authored the university textbook called Taxation and Estate Planning in Canada. So that was a big lift, but really helped me get my head wrapped around some of these complex topics that families have to deal with. Other designations that I've pursued along the way, I've been a member of STEP since it started in Canada. So that's the TEP designation. Also have my ICD.D, which is corporate governance. I have dropped my FCA. I'm not a non-practicing member of the Alberta Law Society, and I did obtain my FEA designation, but I'm inactive with that organization as well. So a bit of an unusual background in terms of my experience and designations. I've had some, outside of a number of professional services firms, so a variety of law firms and accounting firms. I've also worked in financial institutions, so a couple of the large Canadian financial institutions, and also had an opportunity to start up a trust company, a privately owned trust company. And like I say, about 4 years ago now, I just decided to go it on my own, to work with families the way that I feel works really well for me. And I get stressed out around 6-minute billable increments. And I think that's very hard on families as well in the type of work that I do. And I also want to be completely objective and unbiased. And a lot of organizations have very different metrics in terms of how they compensate people. And sometimes those include referral fees or commission-based compensation. And again, for me, those aren't often conducive to the type of work that I do with families. So here I am. I've landed on this model that I work with families and do it kind of my own way. And hopefully we'll get into that at some point in this conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Cindy, what designation do you not have? I mean, really, that's quite an impressive CV. So, and you've obviously had a very multifaceted background with accounting and law inside financial institutions. So you've been around this topic area for many, many years. So let's talk about the concept of wealth and, what does it mean to you? And, is there a more holistic definition rather than just pure financial assets.
Right. And I love this question, and I appreciate you asking this, because it is really, when I work with the family, it is one of the very first questions that I ask them. And, what does wealth mean? And of course, most often people will come back with, well, money and the stuff that we own. And yet they kind of know it's more than that, but they don't really know how to articulate it. And so there's a really great book that I'm sure you're very familiar with, called Complete Family Wealth, by 3 authors, and we can get that information to your audience. But they were, Jay Hughes is one of the 3 authors, and they really start to explore this concept of qualitative wealth. And so the categories of qualitative wealth are social, human, intellectual, and foundational wealth. And they have a really great, in the first edition, I don't know if it's in the second edition, but they had a really great, I call it an ISH, intellectual, social, human capital survey, kind of an assessment tool. It's on a scale of 1 to 5. And I often share this, almost always share this with families to get them thinking about these other types of capital. And so, for example, social capital, some of the questions that this little survey asks is, I communicate with my other family members about important topics, or we collaborate on shared decisions, or we have capable and engaged leadership. So it gets people starting to think about, oh yeah, okay, I need to be thinking about more than the money. From a human perspective, is everybody healthy physically and mentally? Do they have work that they enjoy and find meaningful? Are they finding the family to be supportive in terms of their individual development? Intellectual capital is one that I think people find it a little bit easier to wrap their heads around. That's things like, do you understand your personal finances? And something, again, we'll probably get into a bit more later, is, do you understand your family's financial wealth and all the structures and the roles and responsibilities around those structures? And then the really, really big one that is often overlooked, because it's hard, it's really hard, is what is your shared purpose? If you're going to have any kind of legacy wealth or shared wealth going forward, why do you want to do that? And maybe you don't, but if you do, then you do need to get pretty clear on a shared purpose and what your shared values are when you're going to start applying those to your shared financial assets. So those are things for families to really consider before they start diving in, because it's way easier to talk about numbers and people can get their heads around that. And often that's where they want to start. But there's enough people out here in the universe now talking this different language, and these concepts are fortunately becoming a lot more familiar to family members, and they're frankly hungry to explore wealth beyond the numbers.
So, Cindy, you regularly advise high net worth families on how they can successfully transition wealth. What are some of the services that you would offer these families?
Yes. So, part of the reason I go into probably more detail than you wanted on my background is because I've got this unique skill set and blend of background. So a lot of advisors in this space are a bit more siloed. I actually call myself an integrated family wealth advisor because I've got this diverse background. So there's 2 general, I'd say, prongs to the way I have an initial engagement with a family. One is really getting to know the family, the individuals in the family. So that typically involves meetings with individual family members, or sometimes with couples together. And there's a series of questions that I'll ask. It's really just a conversation. So I can get to know them and they can get to know me. So we've had some one-on-one time before I get the whole family together for their first family meeting, because that's going to be pretty intimidating anyways. So there's a lot of subtleties to those kinds of meetings, but they're really important. The other thing is reviewing and understanding the structure that they're in, because this is foundational information they need to have. There's often a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication, assumptions about how things have been set up. So I do pull in all the legal documents, kind of that trifecta of wills, powers of attorney, personal directives. I've seen all kinds of things, and I'm sure both of you have in the work that you've done. I've seen unsigned wills that they thought were signed. Many people don't even have a will, so of course that opens up a conversation. I think one of the most interesting wills I saw that was signed and witnessed actually had in the document still note to draft in paragraphs. So, awkward conversations sometimes that I need to have with the advisors to say, can you make sure this is the last signed copy? I'm not sure if this is going to be a valid will. I don't practice in this area. But again, because I'm a non-practicing lawyer, I'm coming at it with a different lens. I'm non-competitive with the advisors. Many people across Canada I've had the opportunity to work with over the course of my career. So those are relatively comfortable conversations for me to have. And I don't have any skin in the game. I'm not there to say, aha, I found something. I'm there to make sure that everybody looks good, because it's way easier to correct something like that now than to find out 10 years down the road when somebody's died and you're hauled in front of court and your name gets splashed all over a case, which is not fun. So aside from the wills, powers of attorney, personal directives, family trusts, 100%, this for me is one of the most confusing areas that families really cannot wrap their heads around, and spend a lot of time on family trust education. Also with trusts, I've seen some very interesting things when I get in and look at that. One scenario recently, a sister-in-law ended up being named as a beneficiary when she was supposed to have been the trustee. And their CPA was named as a trustee, and he didn't know that he was. So again, things that kind of sneak their way in there, maybe was in an earlier draft, but we really can't expect family members to read these documents and find this kind of information out and question it. Other things I look at, shareholders agreements, a lot of times based on more, big corporate shareholder agreement precedents that aren't always appropriate. They often will have things like shotgun clauses in there, which are probably less helpful in terms of keeping a family together should they need to go their separate ways. So there's different things. That's an entire podcast probably on its own. But, again, shareholders agreements, when I'm working with families on things like that, I've had one scenario where I suggested we actually get the lawyer, the novel concept, get the lawyer and the accountant into the room at the same time. And this family had had the same lawyer and accountant for over 25 years. And when I mentioned that, they said, you can actually do that? Yeah, you can actually do that. And then after the meeting, they said, and I called the lawyer and I called the accountant, explained the work that I was doing, explained the purpose of the meeting, said I can be there, I don't need to be there. But after the meeting, the family said that was the most productive meeting we've ever had with our advisors in the whole time that we've worked with them. So shareholders agreements, trusts, wills, PDs, powers of attorney, and I will ask for prenups, cohabs. I have to be honest, I can't remember a time when I've actually seen one, but it does get their thinking caps on those documents. One family I worked with, we did end up getting them in place. It was kind of a fun conversation because they got to this, how are we going to, who's going to pay for these things? Because often there's that imbalance of financial power, right, between the family member and the incoming partner. And so they had agreed that they were going to pay for up to two independent legal advice for up to two partners for one family member, because there was some concern he might go through a few of these iterations. So, you can actually make it a relatively lighthearted conversation, but there are practicalities there that need to be anticipated ahead of time. So that's basically the two prongs. It's kind of like this legal side of things and then this family side of things.
So what I'm hearing is you do a deep dive into documents, which families often probably don't understand. You quarterback advisors, but I think my understanding, because we've known each other for a number of years, is you're particularly skilled in and around governance, and we'll talk about that. But before we do that, let's talk about the three-circle model. So the interface of family, business, and ownership, and how that plays into how you approach a family.
Yeah. So the three-circle model, there's lots of great information out there on the three-circle model. And as you've mentioned, it really focuses on three systems. The family system, which is who are the members of your family, which in and of itself is a discussion, right? And this is a really, really robust conversation to have with family members individually as well as collective. And when you start to put your governance mechanisms in place, it's critical. I'm going to jump to the ownership system, one that frankly often gets overlooked. We tend to focus in this space primarily on family governance and business governance. So we'll come back to owner governance at some point. But I do work with family businesses, but I find most of my clients actually are family enterprises. Even if they have a family business, they're a family enterprise. So I find the three-circle model a little bit limiting sometimes. I actually use it for the very higher level concept of perspectives and, use that as a foundational concept to get people thinking in a neutral way about, oh yeah, I can see, even if they don't have a family business, how people in each of those different systems might have a very different perspective.
So how would you distinguish between a family business and a family enterprise?
Right. So a family business to me is an operating business. It's not a holding company. It's not a trust. It's not a random investment portfolio that may be with one or more investment advisors or a real estate portfolio. A business is an actual business. It's a standalone entity with a board of directors, and you've got employees and management. And so you're really focused on another model. It's called the four-room model, like who's in which of those, who's on the board and who's on family governance and who's on ownership governance. And when do you get to go into these different rooms? So for me, the family enterprise is all those other things, and the bag of chips. It's like all the other stuff that families own. And you don't just own a family business. So pretty much every family is a family enterprise. So unless the engagement is really limited to that particular entity, which has never been the case in any situation that I've worked on, it is there's a broader enterprise there. And for me, again, I think it's really important that we have this broader lens. It may be that at some point we need to focus specifically on owner governance, or we need to focus specifically on what's going on in the business. But as a starting point, I really want people to understand that bigger enterprise and the dynamics in play across all the different pieces of that puzzle.
What are some of the best practices of families successfully transitioning or have transitioned wealth?
Well, I'm going to combine this into two things. Number one, I find the hardest thing, and I think I mentioned this already, the hardest thing for family members to wrap their heads around are their trusts. And so one of the things right away before we even get into starting to craft governance documents and figuring out what our governance should be for this family is understanding how trusts are set up. Most often in the structures that I see, there will be a trust at the top of the food chain that owns shares in a holding company, and then the holding company owns shares in an operating company. That's the simplest form of that. We all sitting around the table here know that gets a lot more complicated. But not understanding how trusts work and then just ignoring that. And I think people and a lot of advisors in this space, they don't intentionally ignore it, but they don't have the skill set or the background, the education or the language, frankly, to explain these concepts to families. And trust governance for me is absolutely critical right out of the gate. Even if you're a family that has no holding companies and no operating entities, you probably have a testamentary trust in your will if you've got any measure of wealth. So again, you really need to understand, these structures. So when we move into governance itself, governance per se, I've found that certainly not easy, although that was the term I was going to use, the easiest place to start. The most common place to start is with a family charter. Or some people call it.
Before you jump in, maybe for lay people listening, what exactly is governance and why do you want it?
This is a really good question. I'm going to try and think. Matt Fulbrook has the best definition, and I'm going to see if I can get it right. Cultivating effective conditions to make good decisions. I love that definition. I'm going to say it again. Cultivating effective conditions to make good decisions. And so just pausing there, like, what are those good conditions, right? What are those effective conditions? Gosh, you have to have good communication. You have to have foundational knowledge. You have to have understanding of what you're going to be governing. And so all these things we've already talked about and more are key to creating these effective conditions. Education, which is something we can talk a bit more about later, just creating really robust learning systems within the family so people are curious. They're encouraged to be curious. They're encouraged to ask questions. They're encouraged to think broadly. And then we can start diving into some of these foundational documents that are used in a governance context. So then going for me again to the working mostly in the family circle on governance, I would look at starting with the family charter. And I've seen some families take this as, pretty simple. It might be a relatively short document.
But Cindy, maybe it'd be helpful if you explain to people what a family charter is. So I think what happens for those of us that work in this space is we're so used to throwing these terms around. But let's assume that our listeners have never heard these concepts before, and let's define them before we jump in.
Yeah, that's great. So what I was going to say is a family charter will start to look at things like, how do we define family? It will look at things like, what are our shared values? What is our shared purpose? Maybe it'll have a code of conduct that's built into it. And then it will start looking at these very basic policies. So, for example, the prenups that we just talked about, or are we going to have, our goal is to have regular family meetings, or we're going to establish a family council. Well, then that leads to your question is like, well, what's a family council? Right. So the family charter is overall, it's the family's thinking about key policies that they want to put in place, who's who in the family. They don't, how they're going to define family, which makes it really clear for people. What are all they might include separate policy statements that are attached. For example, a policy on philanthropy. They might have an investment committee. They might have so with the investment committee, they would develop an investment policy statement. They might have an education committee that would work towards helping make sure that families are educated. Family members are educated in areas that are of interest to them. And that could include post-secondary. It could include some coaching. It could include maybe like a community course that somebody wants to take, depending on how broad or narrow they want to define that. What other things have I seen? Health, there could be policies on health. Are we going to pay for if somebody can't get in because the wait lists are too long? Are we going to provide some financial support so they can go private? If somebody's been off work for a period of time or because of health related matters, are we going to provide them some financial support while they're off work? So the family charters can be really creative. And as you can imagine, just from the things that I've shared so far, it's really generates a lot of conversation with the family. There'll be strong opinions in some cases, but that whole dialogue builds community within the family and how we feel about these things before the what hits the fan. Because once we're in those stressful situations, it's way harder to have these conversations.
So a lot of that is very sophisticated. How much wealth does a family generally have before they start thinking about such sophisticated structures or retaining an expert like you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of a how long is a piece of rope question. I would say for sure 8 figures typically. I can't say that I've personally worked with families that have been below 8 figures, and then it's zeros. I will say that while there can be a bit more complexity when there are more zeros, the fundamental issues and opportunities remain the same.
So you're talking about best practices. Can you talk to us about what are some of the pitfalls? Like, what are some of the mistakes families make? And if they don't have someone like you advising them, what do you see families do where it impacts wealth accumulation and transition?
Yeah, lots of things. I think fundamentally there's a fear about disclosing wealth. I think we're getting better at that. I think we're getting better because a lot of the wealth holders, whatever generation that is now, if it's generation 1 or generation 2, are just demographically, we all know there's whatever number of trillions of dollars that are in play over the next number of years. And they're starting to have either experienced it as a wealth inheritor themselves, or they've seen other people go through a wealth transition where somebody's passed away and the will is we start having the big reveal and the fighting starts. And the cost of the litigation is one thing, but the destruction of family relationships is a whole other ballgame. And it doesn't just affect this generation, it affects generations coming up. And so really the work is so important. And so a common pitfall is just saying, oh, we'll get to that, we'll get to that, we'll get to that. It's like, we'll get to our will. Well, get to your will. Like, start having these, getting these things in place and thinking about this, this legacy piece. And don't, as parents, make assumptions for your kids about what they would want or what they don't want. Let them have their voice without judgment, and know that they may not get everything that they want, but I have an example. Oh my gosh. I was meeting with a family, and it was kind of the first time I was meeting with them. And we were talking about, the mom had passed away. The father was in assisted living. One of the older daughters was living with the father. And she had started to clean up the house as he'd moved into assisted living. And we were talking about things that, family members don't talk about, which are the art on the wall and the jewelry and the whatever it is, right? That those emotional trigger items that might not be worth a lot financially. And they ended up having this. So one of the answer I always get is, when I ask them if they've thought about these emotional objects, they'll almost always say, oh, we don't have anything of value. And I'm like, it doesn't have to have value. And in that meeting, one of the brothers said, well, where's Dad's gun collection? And the sister who'd been living in the house, she said, oh, I got rid of that a couple of years ago. And the brother almost launched across the table at her because he was very connected to that gun collection for whatever reasons. So this turned into this interesting roundtable conversation, ultimately culminating in, where is the white metal salt shaker with the red lid from the farm? So, if we're not talking about these things ahead of time, you don't have the opportunity to share those. It's not like you're putting red dots on the art around the house, but you do want, I think it's nicer to give, or at least know that you're going to be receiving and have had a conversation about that painting that Mom did when she was first learning to paint, or the hunting trips that we used to go on, or gosh, we had these great family dinners at the farm all the time and everybody loved the salt shaker. Anyway, so that's one story. I think, the sphere of disclosing wealth, having those conversations that we're leaving too late, assuming what people want, those are all really important things. Other pitfalls, parents trying to explain legal documents, whether you're a lawyer or not. I think it's really hard to explain those things to your own family. And people are going to start asking questions. And I've seen people get backed into corners where they're going to dig in and say, yes, that's the way it works, because that's what my lawyer told me, or that's what my accountant told me, or I was golfing with so-and-so, and they said this is how their foundation works, whatever it is. I also think another pitfall is excluding in-laws and others from the process, and not letting rising gens participate from quite young ages. I've got a family that I work with. We just had our 4th annual family assembly, and the Gen 3s have been, that was their 4th meeting. They were 17 and 15 this year. So they were quite young when they came in. And the second year, I remember them going, oh gosh, no, not the financial part again. And I remember saying something like, you will learn to appreciate this in a few years. It might be painful now. I think another thing, and I'll leave it maybe at this, is, and it kind of goes back to this not understanding your wealth structures. Sometimes people do need to go outside of their existing advisor network. There's not always that skill set within their advisor network to have some of these broader conversations. We are getting more people trained in this space, but it really is helpful to have somebody who's neutral, objective, and just has a really fresh lens on everything. So I think I'll leave it at that in terms of pitfalls that I've seen.
So, Cindy, I had a question about, when would you normally be engaged in this wealth building? When do you see families coming for your services?
Too late, typically. In that, I say that because they're already well into it. One family that I had, they were fantastic. So one fellow they were doing their first estate freeze, and there was another advisor that we had in common, and he had been saying to this other advisor, my lawyer is telling me X, my accountant is telling me Y, and his exact words were, I don't know who to trust. And the advisor said, just call Cindy, she'll explain it to you. So I get this random phone call. I spend an hour with him, sort of bouncing a few things around, explaining what was going on. He said, I've learned more from you in an hour than I have from either of my advisors who I've been working with now for over 8 years. And that's because I'm not in the weeds, right? I'm up here where the clients are. And so I really find, it's important to have that. In their case, he started early. Like, he wasn't afraid. I'm going to say this, and I don't mean it to be dismissive at all, but he's not afraid to ask the dumb questions. They're actually really, really important questions. But a lot of people somehow think they're supposed to know this stuff, and they shouldn't ask. And the more you ask, the more informed you are, the better you're going to be in your governance, because you're creating the effective conditions to make good decisions, right? So you need to understand this stuff before you get into it.
Are there any final tips you would wish to leave our listeners with?
Number one is going to be education. So really making sure that you're getting education where you can. Your advisors can give you a bunch of books. Nicole will have a great library that she, I'm sure, can share, and I can give her some additional if she wants. I'm also the Chief Learning Officer for Tamarind Learning Canada. They have a great self-assessment tool that you can find at tamarindlearning.ca, and that'll really just give you a broad overview of key concepts that you should be aware of, like stewardship, or we've been talking about trust. What does it mean to be a beneficiary? What's a trust? Basic concepts around estate planning, tax, and gosh, I think we cover personal finance. Well, I know we cover personal finance and investing as well. So that's one thing. Another thing that I would really like to draw people's attention to is the great work the Ultra High Net Worth Institute is doing in the US. Please do not let that ultra high net worth label throw you off this. They have worked on a really fantastic model called the 10 Domains of Wealth. And it really helps family members understand this broad wealth management industry, terms that are kind of meaningless, like family office. What does that mean? What is wealth management? And that's how this 10 domains model actually came to be. It was, and I won't go into the detail of it, but ultimately it was a group of a number of advisors across Canada and the US, academics, advisors, and family members who sat down. They kind of ripped back okay, what are all the things that wealth management could be? And I think they came up with something like 180 different topics. And so then they were like, okay, we need to create a system to analyze this. And they came up with these 10 domains. So there's a wonderful case study in there. It's very accessible. It helps for family members to understand the roles of different advisors, make sure that those advisors are staying in their lane. If they're a lawyer, are they practicing law? Are they starting to drift into other areas? And, if they're investment advisors similarly, or do they have the training to do that beyond their primary field of expertise? And also, I think this idea comes out of this whole 10 domains is the real importance of collaboration among the advisor team, but also the advisors with the family and then within the family. And then the only other thing I would say is start soon. Like, don't wait. Have a conversation with whoever your go-to trusted advisor is and say, I'm interested in finding out more about this. What do you do, or who can you direct me to? And and get going.
So, Cindy, you've been an incredible resource. Thank you so much. And it sounds like, to summarize what I'm hearing, it's proactive, early communication. Would that be what you would advise, or?
Yep, proactive, early communication, and education.
Great. Yeah. Where can our listeners find you?
Oh, yes. So LinkedIn right now is probably the best place. So I'm on LinkedIn, Cindy Radu. I also have a webpage, which is cindyradu.com, and connect@cindyradu.com for an email address. Thank you for asking. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered individual legal, financial, or tax advice. Make sure to consult the advisor of your choice to advise you on your own circumstances. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your Estate Matters. If you like this podcast, make sure to follow it on your podcast platform of choice.
Whether you are planning your own estate or you're acting as executor for somebody else's, Heritage Trust can help. Partner with Heritage Trust to protect your family, your assets, and your legacy.
If you would like more information about Heritage Trust, please visit our website at heritagetrustcompany.ca.
This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.